Good evening, this is Quintus Curtius, and welcome back to the podcast. And this podcast is going to be another movie roundup. And we'll be reviewing and discussing a couple movies that I've seen recently, one of which was the Joker, or just Joker, released this year in 2019. And it's been a very, I don't want to say, maybe not a controversial movie, but a movie that's been featured a lot in the media and the press. And also The Killing Fields, which I've seen several times and saw again. It's a 1984 movie, but I wanted to review it and talk about it because it's becoming clear to me that a lot of the younger folks just don't know about a lot of these old movies, these good classic films from the 80s. And I think it's important to talk about them just to keep interest in them alive, because it's part of our heritage. It's part of our film ethos. So let's talk about the Joker here. Let's talk about the Joker. And you've probably heard various different histrionics in the media about this movie, about what it is or what it purports to be or what it might be or what someone will interpret about it. But I wanted to see it for myself, just to see what I could learn from it and what I could conclude from it. And I wasn't disappointed. It's a movie that's worth seeing. And let's talk about it a little bit here. It's directed by Todd Phillips, who I did not know as a director, and I Googled him, and his Wikipedia page says his previous credits include movies like The Hangover, which was a very, very popular film, Starsky and Hutch, which was not, and various other B movies that you may not have heard of. So I think this is his real stab at real artistry. And he does a very good job. He does a very good job here because this movie has a lot to talk about. It has a lot to talk about. The Obviously a movie like this, it's an origin story about the baddest of the bad guys in the Batman ethos or mythos, the Joker. And he's never really had a legitimate background story before. No one's really ever given him this sort of treatment. If you follow the comics, if you're familiar with the history of Batman, which I'm not really. I mean, I'm a quasi fan. I mean, I'm not like a Batman fanatic. I know a little bit about, just from having grown up in the 70s and 80s, just having read the comics. There are various different stories given about the Joker's origins. There are some stories that say he fell in a vat of acid. There are some that say he was an escapee from a insane asylum. So the Joker is one of these trickster characters that appear a lot in Western in the Western tradition and in mythology. Some scholars have compared him to the in Norse mythology, the Loki, the Joker, and I'm sure he has some analogs in classical mythology. I can't really think of any, but I'm sure there must be some out there if I really searched for it. But the Joker is a very compelling character. Let's face it. Everybody loves the Joker because he seems to embody this anarchic energy and intensity that just seeks to disrupt and destroy without any clear purpose. And there's nothing more frightening in the world than a bad guy whose motivations that we can't really divine. We can't really figure out what motivates them. If they're not motivated by money or any rational motive, someone like that becomes very frightening because they can't really be, as the character said in the movie The Terminator, they can't be reasoned with or bargained with or dealt with. They don't feel pity or pain, and they absolutely will not stop. If you remember, Kyle Reese said in The Terminator. And that's what the Joker is. I think that's one of the fascinations of the Joker character he embodies this demonic intensity that's sort of every man's alter ego. And I think every man in many ways has a dark side that maybe we project onto him, this unreasoning anarchic character that just seeks to disrupt and destroy. So that's the basis of the movie. And I think the best way to see this movie is to see it and interpret it as an origin story. an origin story. It's about the character. I think we start to go astray if we try to project onto this movie our own fears, our thoughts, our political beliefs, our social beliefs, because that's not the right way to approach it. I think the author, I think the director very cleverly tries to play to maybe some popular currents that are going on out there, but everyone can interpret that, can project onto that in its own way, and I think that's in many ways one of the clever mechanisms that the director Todd Phillips has used to garner attention for his movie, to try to deliberately make it controversial, to try to evoke things that we might recognize or sympathize with. But for me as a 50-year-old man, I will tell you what things resonated with me about it, for what that's worth. Number one of the things that jumped out at me, which I liked and I appreciated, was he set the film is set in the early '80s in New York City, I think in 1981 or 1980, which was a pretty bad time for the city. I'm not a New Yorker, but I'm aware of what was going on around that time. There had been riots. There had been in 1976 or 77. There had been some serious riots during the blackout in New York. It was a rough period. It was a grungy, dark, very dismal period in the history there. There was a lot of bad things going on. I do remember, and I think this movie did speak to this, and I haven't heard any other commentator talk about this, but the subway vigilante, the Bernard Goetz shootings, and I think which is in 1981 or 2 or 1980. I can't remember exactly, but you may not remember. But this was a big news piece in the early '80s. This was a marginalized loner named Bernard Goetz who shot and incapacitated some muggers on a subway in New York City. And this incident is not really referred. Well, there is a subway shooting in the movie, which to my mind recalled that incident. And I don't know if the director was deliberately trying to do that, but that's something to me that resonated. But anyway, the movie really centers on a marginalized, mentally disturbed young man, or well, maybe not that young, but he seems like he's in his early 30s, and he lives with his mother, his incapacitated mother, whom he takes care of. But he himself is on 7 different medications, and he sees social services people. He clearly has mental issues. He's also an aspiring comic. And this is a guy who works during the day doing different gigs as a clown for hire. Like he'll be hired by stores to announce sales. He'll go to children's hospitals, do performances, various different things like that. And the movie really shows his steady progression from a somewhat, well, he always has had a tenuous, a very sketchy hold on reality, but this guy suffers a series of mishaps. He gets fired from his job, he gets abused, he gets assaulted, he gets demeaned in various ways. And these incidents trigger a certain spiral, and it sends him into a downward spiral, and he essentially retaliates by adopting this persona, this Joker persona, this all-powerful persona to, I suppose, compensate for the situation that he's in. So it's a very personal story. It's told from a very personalized perspective. We see it from we see him going about his business in his apartment, his interactions with his coworkers, and the movie makes certain nods to its cultural predecessors. If you're a movie buff like I am, you can see clear references in here to Taxi Driver, the movie Taxi Driver, 1976. You can see references to The King of Comedy, both of which are Robert De Niro vehicles. And it's no accident at all that Robert De Niro appears in this movie as a talk show host or as a variety show host, kind of fulfilling the same role that Jerry Lee Lewis or Jerry Lewis, I'm sorry, Jerry Lewis, not Jerry Lee Lewis, but Jerry Lewis fulfilled in the movie King of Comedy. So there's clear references to, now it's not, the movie doesn't rip off those films. I would say they're simply nods in the direction of those films. But those movies were much grittier. Those movies were much, those were Scorsese films. I mean, they were much grittier, much, I think in many ways darker, much edgier. And obviously I'm not going to fault this guy, for Todd Phillips, for not measuring up to Scorsese. I mean, who does? You know, but Phillips wisely does not stray too far beyond the realm of what he can do. This is an origin story, and Phillips makes it very clear throughout the film that he doesn't intend it to be anything other than an origin story. So all these critics that are trying to project onto this movie their own fears about, incels and marginalized people and safety and all this other stuff are very misplaced. It's very misplaced. And when I saw this film, there was actually a police officer in the theater, which to me says a lot about, it just kind of says a lot about where we are as a society more than it says about the movie. Because I didn't find anything in the movie that is suggestive of violence or encouraging violence or anything like that. Kind of reminds me of all the fuss and the nonsense about The Warriors. When this movie, The Warriors, which I think came out in the early 80s also, I think 82 or 81, or I don't remember, there were all these fights that broke out of the movie, and then I guess there were some shootings and things, and everybody just lost their minds. And the movie got blamed for inciting violence, and there were some theaters that would not show it. But when you look at it today, it looks very tame. And I predict the same thing will happen with the Joker. I think when people look at Joker, say 5 years from now, 10 years from now, they're going to say, "What was all the fuss about? This is just a story." So let's first talk about the strong points of the movie. It's a very, very well done character study of this Arthur Fleck, this character that's portrayed by Joaquin Phoenix. Does a very, very good job. The camera lingers for a long time on all of his obsessions, his worries, his laughing impulse. He has this involuntary impulse in laughing. So the movie really spends a lot of time about that. But one of the I think the movie's biggest strong point, which no one has talked about, the biggest strong point here with this film is it gives us a very, very specific reason why Arthur Fleck, or Joker, has a grudge against the Batman. It's a very specific obsession, and it has to do with family. I'm not going to reveal it. I'm not going to talk about it too much, but there's something very, very personal that's revealed in here where Arthur Fleck finds out from his mother, or from some of his mother's writings, about about a reason why he might have a grudge against the Wayne family. And by extension, Bruce Wayne. It's very particular. It's very specific. And it makes all the sense in the world. And this was what I really liked about this movie, because it showed, it elevated maybe elevated the Joker from just being this random, faceless, voiceless, anarchic force to someone who has a very specific and legitimate grievance. A very specific and legitimate grievance. And you'll have to see the movie to really understand what I'm talking about. Once you see it, you'll understand. And then you can judge for yourself. But that was what the one of the strong points I liked about the movie. But I liked the early 80s grungy feel, the decayed New York City feel to it, the Bernard Goetz references, the references to Taxi Driver, the references to King of Comedy, both of movies which a lot of people, millennials, have not seen, which they should see. I keep forgetting. It's one of the things as you get older, sometimes you just forget how old you are. You wake up. I mean, I'm 50 years old. I mean, I turn around and I say, how the hell did this happen? It happened because of the progression of years, brother. That's just how it happens. I mean, and as fast as it happened to me, it's going to happen to you too. So Smarten up, and you'll find out what it's like. Anyway, anyway, the movie is very good in those very good in those respects. There are some weaknesses here. I will say there are some minor weaknesses. I would not call them game-changing drawbacks. There are some minor weaknesses. I think it goes on a little bit too long. I think the camera lingers a little bit too much on his little dances in his room and his gnarly, gristly body. I don't. Do we really need to see that? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. You can decide. But all in all, this is a worthy, I will say, my final verdict on Joker is this is the greatest origin story for a comic book character that's been done yet. I will say that. It's a legitimate attempt to put a human face behind one of the most mysterious and compelling bad guys in comic book fiction, if you want to call it that. And we do this all the time. These types of things have legitimate literary predecessors. In the ancient world, many poets, Apollonius, wrote his poem on Jason and Argonautica, wrote his own take on Jason and the Argonauts. Other poets wrote their own take on Jason and the Argonauts. Some storytellers would talk about, there were certain stock characters in the ancient world and also in the medieval world, certain stock characters. And every writer would maybe do his own riff on that character. And that's all this is. These comic book characters have in many ways taken the place of the classical canon of mythology. And that was one of the great things I remember about the movie. What was it, that M. Night Shyamalan movie? What was it called? Unbreakable, where Samuel Jackson, he has a comic book art gallery or whatever, and he talks about comic book characters in many ways are the modern successors of classical mythology. And there's a lot of truth to that. It's a very, very observant statement. But the Joker has become kind of just another one of these mythological figures, just like Jason or Achilles or Odysseus or whatever. Now, we don't talk about the classical heroes as much as we used to. Maybe we should. But everybody knows about the Joker. Everyone knows about Batman. And this movie holds out the tantalizing prospect that the Joker and the Batman may have a lot more intimate connections than anyone has ever appreciated or talked about. And you'll have to see the movie to understand what I mean about that. You'll have to see the movie. And I think it's worth seeing. It's worth seeing. It's not the greatest classic ever created, okay? I'm not going to go that far. But it's a worthy origin story. It's a worthy origin story. So see it if you can and appreciate it for what it is. Again, certain stock characters have a way of, in the same thing with Shakespeare. Characters like Hamlet, like Macbeth, like Richard III. All of these characters, there's a reason why Shakespeare's plays are redone every generation or every so many years, because every generation has to do its own riff on these characters. And that's the same thing, I think, with these comic book figures. Every generation has to supply its own take, has provide its own riff on these characters. So that's why you should see this movie, and that's how you should interpret it. All right. So enough about Joker. Let's move on very quickly here to The Killing Fields, a 1984 movie directed by Roland Joffe, I think. Very, very good movie. I'm not going to talk very much about this movie because I think you can find all you need to find about this movie, but see it if you haven't seen it. Basically, this movie is I think one of the most effective and meaningful explorations of friendship, suffering, and heroism that's ever been put on film. It's a very, very great movie, and it's basically centers on the friendship and working camaraderie between two journalists, Sidney Schonberg of the New York Times and his assistant, his Cambodian translator and assistant or co-worker, Dith Pran. And the political backdrop is the collapse or the fall of the Cambodian government in 1975 to the Khmer Rouge revolutionary movement, communist revolutionary movement, which I shouldn't even have to say this, but I'm afraid that I do. This was a bloodthirsty and a terrifyingly ruthless communist primitivist movement which took power in Cambodia and basically carried out a horrific genocide on the population, just murdering millions of people who had any ties to modernity or education or the old system. I don't want to go into all that because you can find all that in the popular press if you're interested. But the movie centers on that backdrop. But it's a very, very tense, very, very, very intelligent, very exciting, very intense film, which focuses on the relationship between these two men and how Cambodia falls to the Khmer Rouge, and how Dith Pran, who's left behind, who cannot escape, has to escape from a Khmer Rouge labor camp. So you need to see this movie. You need to see this movie. You need to see this movie, period. There's no debate about this. You need to see it, period. There's no discussion involved here. So please see the film. It's not perfect. It's very close to being perfect, but there are some few. Seeing it again, I had not seen it in a number of years, but seeing it again made me conscious of there's a few mid-'80s political flavors to it that I might find objectionable. The director seems to imply in a few places that it was the United States may have had a hand or a contributing hand here in the agony that Cambodia endured. I think that I don't believe that. To put it very briefly, during the Vietnam era, during the Vietnam War, it was Cambodia that did not have the will or the military power to stop North Vietnam from establishing sanctuaries along its border with North and South Vietnam. So they got pulled into the war. And when the United States lost the Vietnam War and pulled out, Cambodia found itself faced with its own communist insurgency, which was backed by Beijing, backed by the Chinese. The Khmer Rouge was backed by the Chinese. Let's not forget that. And Cambodia was, by that time, America had just cut its losses in Southeast Asia. America wanted nothing to do with anything involving Southeast Asia. So America basically just left. And Cambodia was faced with the full force of this Khmer Rouge insurgency. And the people that are responsible for that genocide is the Khmer Rouge, period. No one else. No one else can be... That disaster cannot be laid at the doorstep of anyone else except the Khmer Rouge, period, in my view. So there are a few little comments in there that imply that somehow our bombing in Cambodia somehow, triggered this. And I say to that, bullshit. Bullshit. That's just bullshit. Okay? But in any case, this is a great movie. A fantastic film just based on the criteria of cinematic art. So you should see it. All right. So that will conclude our podcast here for today. I'm Quintus Curtius. Good night.